A quiet road, flashing lights in your mirror, your stomach drops before your brain even catches up. Then comes the knock on the window and a question that sounds almost too ordinary to matter. Where are you coming from? Let me ask you something before we go deeper into this, because most people answer this on pure instinct and never think twice about it. When you hear that question in a traffic stop, what do you usually say first without overthinking it? Be honest and drop your answer in the comments, because this is one of those moments where instinct can quietly shape everything that follows. And I want you to actually think about your answer before you keep reading, because what I'm about to explain is not the kind of thing most drivers ever learn until it's too late. Now, here's the uncomfortable truth that very few people talk about in a clear way. That question is not casual. It sounds like conversation. It feels like small talk. But in reality, it's one of the most strategically important questions during a traffic stop, because it helps establish something officers rely on heavily: your timeline. Not just where you were, but when you were there, how long you stayed, whether your explanation matches your behavior, and whether your story stays consistent under pressure. From the officer's point of view, this is not about curiosity. It's about building context. Every answer becomes a data point, and those data points start forming a picture. Let's slow this down so you can really see how it works. When a driver says, "I'm coming from work," that sounds simple, clean, normal. But now the officer has something to measure against reality. What time is it? Does your appearance match a work environment? Does your route make sense for a typical commute? Does your behavior suggest fatigue, routine, or something else entirely? Most drivers don't realize that their answer doesn't stand alone. It immediately gets compared against everything else visible in that moment. And if something doesn't align perfectly, even slightly, the situation doesn't end there. It often expands, not because the driver is guilty, but because inconsistency creates curiosity, and curiosity creates follow-up questions. Now, here's where things start to get legally sensitive in a way most people don't expect. You don't have to lie to create a problem. You just have to be imprecise under pressure. Think about how often people speak casually when they're nervous. You might say, "I was just out with friends," but forget to mention you stopped somewhere else earlier. Or you might say, "I'm heading home," when technically you still have another stop planned. To you, it's normal conversation. To the officer, it becomes a timeline that can be checked against other observations. And once a timeline is established verbally, it can be compared to everything else in the stop. That's where misunderstandings start building quietly. Let's walk through a real-world scenario that happens more often than people realize. You're pulled over late at night. The officer asks where you're coming from. You say, "Dinner with a friend." That seems harmless, right? But now the officer has additional context forming in their mind. Late hour, location, traffic conditions, your demeanor, maybe even a faint smell of alcohol that you don't think much of. Suddenly, your simple answer becomes part of a larger evaluation, not because it's suspicious on its own, but because it opens the door to more questions. Where was dinner? What time did you leave? How much did you eat or drink? How long were you there? You didn't invite those questions intentionally, but your answer made them relevant. And that's the key point most drivers miss. Your words don't just answer questions, they create new ones. Now let's address something that causes a lot of confusion online. People often believe there is a perfect answer that avoids all problems. That's not how real-world interactions work. There is no magic sentence that guarantees anything in a traffic stop. What matters more than the exact wording is understanding what your words do once they leave your mouth. Do they create clarity or complexity? Do they stay consistent or open room for interpretation? That's what actually matters. Now, from a legal perspective, you also need to understand something important that most drivers never think about. You are not required to volunteer a detailed narrative of your movements. In most situations, you are required to provide identification and basic compliance with lawful instructions. But beyond that, the conversation enters a different space where every word is optional in terms of self-disclosure. And this is where many people unintentionally make things harder for themselves, because they assume cooperation means talking more. In reality, cooperation and overexposure are not the same thing. Cooperation is calm compliance. Overexposure is unnecessary explanation. And overexposure is where people often create contradictions without realizing it. Let me explain how this plays out in practice. You answer the initial question, then you try to sound helpful, so you add details. Then you remember something slightly differently and correct yourself. Then you try to explain again to be clearer. Now, instead of one simple statement, you have three versions of a story. And even if all three are honest, the human brain, especially under stress, doesn't process them as perfectly aligned. The officer now has to reconcile them. And that process is where stops often become longer and more detailed. Not because something is wrong, but because the narrative is no longer clean. Let's go deeper into what's happening on the officer's side, because understanding that changes everything about how you interpret the question. Officers are trained to observe three things at once: verbal responses, physical behavior, and environmental context. Your answer is just one part of that system. They're also watching how fast you answer, whether you hesitate, whether your eyes shift, whether your hands stay steady, whether your tone changes when certain topics are introduced. That's why even a simple question like, "Where are you coming from?" carries more weight than it seems. It's not just the answer that matters, it's how the answer fits into everything else. Now here's where a lot of drivers unknowingly put themselves at a disadvantage. They over-explain. They think more detail equals more credibility. But in high-pressure situations, too much detail can actually create more opportunities for misunderstanding. Because every additional detail becomes another point that can be questioned, interpreted, or cross-checked. That doesn't mean giving less information is suspicious. It just means unnecessary detail can sometimes complicate what should have been a simple exchange. Let's be very clear about something important here. Staying silent or limiting information does not automatically mean guilt, and in many legal contexts, choosing not to elaborate is a protected right. But the way you do it matters. There is a difference between respectful boundaries and defensive behavior. One keeps the interaction calm, the other escalates tension. That distinction is everything. Now let's talk about the most common mistake that creates real problems in these situations. Trying to sound innocent. People believe they can talk their way into looking more trustworthy, so they add explanations they were never asked for. "I was just grabbing food, nothing else. I only stopped for a minute. I swear I didn't do anything wrong." The intention is to reassure, but in practice it often does the opposite. Because now the officer is no longer just listening to facts. They're also analyzing why reassurance is being emphasized so strongly. In law enforcement training, that kind of over-clarification can sometimes be interpreted as nervousness or inconsistency, even when it's completely innocent. So, again, the issue is not what you say in isolation, it's how it fits into the broader behavioral picture. Now, I want to bring you back to the original question. Where are you coming from? At this point, you can probably see that it's not a simple conversational prompt. It's a gateway into context building, a way to understand movement, timing, and consistency. And depending on how you respond, it either stays a simple exchange or becomes the foundation for deeper questioning. So, what actually is the safest mindset to have in that moment? It's not fear, and it's not silence for the sake of silence. It's awareness. Awareness that every answer you give becomes part of a larger picture. Awareness that you don't need to fill every gap in conversation. An awareness that calm, controlled communication is far more effective than emotional explanation. Because once you understand that, the entire dynamic shifts. You stop reacting instinctively. You start responding intentionally. And that alone changes how the interaction unfolds more than any perfect sentence ever could. And maybe that's the real lesson most drivers never hear clearly. It's not about finding the right words. It's about understanding what words actually do in a situation where everything is being observed, compared, and quietly evaluated in real time. And once you see that clearly, you don't hear that simple question the same way again.